Snow falls like ash when a city is about to burn. It drifts through the bare fingers of the Ardennes forest, hushing the roads, muffling bootsteps, turning breath into ghosts. Somewhere in the white, a small boy carries a loaf of bread into a cellar filled with strangers. An American medic nods thanks without looking up. The man on the blanket is bleeding into the straw. Down the street, a sign leans at the edge of the town, Bastogne. Over the hills comes the low growl of engines, the creak of treads over frozen ruts, the clatter of chain-linked armor. Behind the trees, in fields cut by hedgerows and winter hedges, German panzer crews wipe the frost from their periscopes. Young Volksgrenadiers rub their hands together and blow on their fingers. They have been told this will turn the war. The sky is sealed by iron-gray cloud, and the days begin in gloom and end in darkness. The counterattack, the last great gamble of a regime staring into its own ending, is coming to a crossroads town that never aspired to a place in the world's memory. Inside the besieged town is a man who did not expect to be in command. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, a career artilleryman, compact, polite, and almost preternaturally calm, is sitting in a chilly room when a German delegation arrives under a white flag. The note they put in his hands is courteous, cleanly typed, and thin as a blade. To the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne, it begins, and the terms that follow are labeled honorable. They promise good treatment, safety for civilians, the sparing of further bloodshed. There is a time limit. Artillery is being prepared, they say. Surrender can live. Resist and be crushed. One word will come back out of the room and into the snows of our shared imagination. But before we get to that word, we stand outside with the men of the 101st Airborne Teenage Paratroopers, with faces reddened by cold, glider infantrymen whose last ride down from the sky had no engines, artillerymen in olive drab wool who coax life from howitzers that freeze to the earth between fires. They had been in reserve after a long year. Normandy, the hedgerows, the bridges of the Netherlands. They are worn at the elbows, patched at the knees, and marching toward a place few of them had heard of a week ago. The attack that brought them here had come like a black tide. The Germans had built it in secrecy and sent it crashing into what the Allies thought was a quiet front. It smashed through thin American lines in the Ardennes, pushed roads full of refugees and retreating units into clog and chaos, and drove armored spearheads toward the Meuse River. At the heart of that terrain lay Bastogne, 7 roads knotted into a town that in peacetime measured life by the market day. In war, it was a switch in the wall. Leave it open, and the German armor went through to the river and the ports beyond. Close it, and the tide might stall and recede. The 101st Airborne and the men who gathered around them were told, in essence, to be the wall. They did not have winter boots. They did not have enough blankets. They had marched and ridden in open trucks through sleet and dark to get there. They had rations for days, not weeks. They had their training. They had each other. The young men from Georgia and New York, from Ohio and Texas, from Little Italy and small-town Iowa, tied their scarves tight around their throats, pulled their watch caps down over their ears, and filed out to the ring of small villages that would become anchors in a storm. Foy, Navel, Neff, Marvy, Bisery, Warden, Hemrul, Champs. A siege is not cinematic when you are inside it. It is a month of small things, each one of them larger than life. A breath held while a patrol crosses a road. A hand on a friend's shoulder in the dark. The sudden crack that means a tree has been hit and is coming down. The scrape of a spoon in a ration tin. The momentary wink of a match in a gloved hand. The hiss of a mortar from the woods. The strange peace of a knocked-out tank cooling in the snow. Still, some moments become symbols because they hold all the rest inside them. The German letter, the American reply. A word that was both colloquial and defiant, absurd and deadly serious. It is easy now to tell it like a joke that breaks tension, to soak the page in swagger and pride. But if you could stand in that frozen room, feel the drafts gnaw up your sleeves, hear artillery being registered at a distance, see the faces of clerks and colonels, and look at a map that shows your division and a shard of Belgium surrounded by enemy flags, you would understand how almost impossible it is to make a human sound that is not a tremor. The man who did it was not a legend yet. He was a soldier who chose a word, and in choosing it forced the larger world into a sentence it could understand. We will get to the note. We will get to Christmas in the basements, and the day the sky opened and the cars from heaven fell on parachute silk. We will meet the nurse who walked into the fire, and the artilleryman who wrote the hours in steel. We will watch a tank with Thunderbolt 4, painted on its flank, push through the last fields into a town that held. We will walk to the edge of Bastogne when it is quiet and the snow remembers. But first, the roads that led to siege, the men who took them, and the town that taught the world what a simple word can hold. They were resting when the call came down, asleep under roofs for the first time in weeks, boots unlaced, uniforms sloughed off to stiffen on chairs near radiators that clicked and coughed. It was December 18th, 1944, and the 101st Airborne Division paratroopers and glidermen, artillery, medics, and engineers was at Mermelon in France, trying to turn a page. The night before, word had spread through mess lines that German armor had punched through in the Ardennes. By morning, it was not rumor but orders. Pack what you can carry, just what you can carry fall in, and move. They moved in the back of trucks, whose wood-slatted sides were slick with freezing rain. They moved with helmets on and collars up, the wind worrying at their cuffs. It took hours that became a day, traffic jams snarled by streams of retreating vehicles, and refugees walking past in long files, pushing carts and dragging sleds through wet snow, children clinging to adults as they slipped. The paratroopers leaned over the sides to hand out cigarettes and hard candy, trading words in dozens of accents with people whose faces held the same blend of fear and resolve. The driver's eyes were red from the strain of peering through darkness and sleet. Somewhere ahead, a staff car's windshield wipers beat time, and behind it, a convoy inched toward a crossroads town whose name began to appear on the signposts. Bastogne. They arrived in pieces, as the battlefield was becoming a map, but not yet a plan. Elements of the 10th Armored Division's Combat Command B had arrived first teams with terse names and long odds. Team Desabrai to the north at Novel, Team O'Hara toward Warden, Team Cherry blocking roads to the east. They met the leading German reconnaissance with 75mm guns and stall tactics, buying hours at the cost of irreparable machines and irreplaceable men. In Noval, the roar of enemy tanks echoed through the stone streets as snow streaked sideways in a wind that scoured. In the orange wash of tracer fire, the outlines of barns and steeples flickered like old film. When the first paratroopers jogged into town and off toward the outlying villages, they passed tankers with blackened faces and the grim, tired humor of men who had held a line no one believed could be held. McAuliffe, acting as division commander while Maxwell Taylor was in the United States, established his headquarters in the town. Around him, regimental and battalion commanders fanned out to the perimeter. The 506th Parachute Infantry, a regiment already thick with legend and loss, moved toward the north, toward Foy and Novel. The 502nd anchored the northwest and west. The 501st spread toward the east at Byzery and Neff. The 327th Glider Infantry, their aircraft long since left behind, took positions in the south at Marvy and along the roads that ran toward the Luxembourg border. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, their M18 Hellcats fast enough to arrive and fast enough to run when run they must, slipped into low ground and behind hedges to meet armor head-on. And there were other units' anti-aircraft gunners who would turn their barrels to the ground, engineers who would mine roads and blow bridges, field artillery battalions who would measure their days in rounds fired and nights in rounds scrounged. The town emptied of non-combatants as quickly as dignity and weather allowed. Families carried bedding and pots down to cellar floors. Grocers locked their doors, the shop windows already cross-hatched with tape. Priests opened churches and convents. The stone walls that had rung with bells would soon lake with sound of pain and prayers on the same breath. In one of those places, a makeshift hospital, in a large brick convent, two women would become names echoed through time. Renée Lemaire, a Belgian nurse who had seen the Germans return to her city and decided that her place was closer to the wounded than to the safe. And Augusta Chiwy, a nursing aide of Congolese and Belgian heritage, who had traveled to Bastogne to visit her father and stayed to bandage strangers and bear witness in a battle that did not ask for her or anyone's permission. The first day in the perimeter was chaos by definition. German columns probed and punched. The villages that would become anchors were, for the moment, points on a compass as men felt their way through woods and fields to align with neighbors they could not see. Lines are tidy on paper. On the ground in winter, they run crooked, rake and mend, and sometimes vanish in a drift. A sergeant set his machine gun on the crest of a ditch and told the man feeding him, "Tap me on the shoulder when I'm shooting high." A private found in his breast pocket a letter from home, read it with gloved fingers, and put it back in for a luck he did not name. A runner squinted through falling snow for a farmhouse taller than the rest, because it had a weather vane in the shape of a horse that someone had put on his map. Every hill in the Ardennes moves its boundaries by inches with weather, and every wood looks like every other in snow until it is yours. Novel, to the north, became a place where stubbornness hardened to steel. Team Decibrai, reinforced by paratroopers, held while German armor pressed in with the inevitability of storms, then pulled back under orders through fire that ate up the edges of fields and shooed at the rear of columns. The roads leading Novel turned to gauntlets of burning vehicles, German shells walking back and forth like a blind giant seeking his way through a house. Men who had slept on pine duff slept in snow. Where they had chewed damp bread under trees, they chewed it under fire in farmyards. On the town's eastern approaches, the 501st met the first major thrusts with a mixture of nerve and mathematics, measuring yards with rifle fire and meters with 105mm shells from the division's guns. The artillery learned their maps by heart. The orchard at the bend in the road outside Byzery, the hedgerow near Neff where tanks would pause, the stone outbuildings that made neat targets when a spotter on a church spire could see to call a perfect fall of iron on slate roofs. Rain turned to sleet, sleet to snow, and snow to a hard pelt of ice. Winter does not care who you are. It will take your fingers and toes if you let it, and your hope if you do not guard it. The men of the 101st had been issued light jackets and single blankets. They learned quickly to steal heat from the earth, and each other to line foxholes with straw, to wrap feet in burlap and spare cloth under socks to make a second skin, to keep a small tin of bacon grease near the fire to rub on raw skin when numbness threatened. They had been told already what the word frostbite meant. Now they learned it on their body's map. But they also learned how to make the best of rationed warmth. A helmet set near coals becomes a pot. Coffee tastes like victory when it is hot. Letters from home read aloud under a blanket become a chorus against the night. The quiet sector was very loud. German Nebelwerfer rocket launchers announced themselves with a scream at unstrung nerves. The so-called screaming meanies that left orange blooms in the air and splinters in the snow. Mortar chimed like bells made of earth. Mines had their own voices. A click, a whip crack, an instant later the dull punctuation of metal and flesh. The paratroopers had their counter music. The burp of the Thompson, the longer verse of the Browning automatic rifle, the slow authority of a .30 cal machine gun singing a steady law into a dark tree line. The tank destroyers fired and were gone, a kind of Fox's doctrine. Show your teeth, run before the hounds, bite again when a flank presents itself. The field artillery laid out their ammunition on the ground in little cities of shells, their fuses set by cold hands that could no longer feel the difference between brass and skin. By the second day, a ring had formed. Not perfect, not safe, but continuous enough to justify the word siege. East of town, at the 501st's positions, a runner came in with the news delivered without punctuation. They've cut the road. To the west and north, patrols came back with fewer men than they had left with, and reports of armor moving through woods no maps had accounted for. The 47th Panzer Corps had established itself around the town. Bastogne was surrounded. It was now a matter of hours, and then days, and then the kind of time that is measured not by calendars, but by what was endured between dawn and dusk. The ring was enemy. The center was a garrison. The 7 roads were held by men in snow. Somewhere in town, McAuliffe set his coffee down on a map rolled out across a tabletop on which someone had carved initials years before. He was being told in quick sentences what parts of the line had shifted fans of inches, where the artillery had lost contact, where a company needed more 60mm mortar rounds, and which positions held with bayonets and hope. It was not a grand speech he would make that day. It was 100 small directions in a voice that did not rise, that treated fear as an unhelpful consultant, and that asked common men to do uncommon things in fields where cows would graze again if the land would ever forget. In a church whose pews had been moved to make room for litters, Renée Lemaire heated water over a small stove and looked out the broken window at a town suddenly full of soldiers. Augusta Chiwy walked back in with a bundle of linens, her breath white, and smiled at an old woman who had given her the cloth from a cupboard with a shaking hand and a nod. The wounded began to come in like weather, sometimes one at a time, sometimes in a wave after the crest of an attack broke, and the 2 women and the army surgeons set to the kind of work that is not shouted about in memoirs, but quietly remembered in lists of names. Somewhere between the map table and the pews, a town hunkered down and hoped that stone could hold memories better than fire. It is not the first time in history that a message about honor and survival was delivered under a flag of truce, but it is one of the moments that keep the idea of moral stubbornness alive in ordinary mouths. On December 22nd, 2 German officers and 2 enlisted men walked toward lines that did not want visitors, through a white and gray world of hoarfrost and hay bales, carrying a typed offer. They were brought, under guard, to the American command post in Bastogne. The timing was good, in the way that dark humor is good in bleak places. The day before, German attacks had pressed hard against Neuf and Byzery. The ring felt tightest at the buckle there. Ammunition was low, winter was deepening, and the radio traffic from higher headquarters was all nerves and distance. The words on the paper invited the Americans to see reason. The clock on the mantel advanced with indifference. The men in the room read the message. McAuliffe listened. Someone made a joke about giving the Germans a present. Brigadier General McAuliffe, a man whose disposition leaned toward polite understatement even when hurling steel, said aloud the first word that came to mind. It was not no. It was English like a snapped branch, simple and impossible to translate without the spirit. Nuts. In a different moment, it might have been a quip that died with a chuckle. But someone smiled for real in that cold room for the first time in days, and the word felt right. So they typed it. They put it on paper and signed the name of a division. When the German emissaries asked their interpreter what it meant, Carl Joseph Harper did not leave much to ambiguity. In plain terms, he told them it meant, go to hell. The messengers went back through the snow with a letter in a glove, and that glove became a myth in its own right. Sometimes history puts a whole battle into a single word because the rest is too much to carry. Sometimes it's because that word really did carry the weight everyone else was shouldering. While one word went out, hundreds of thousands of words were being said that day in cellars and foxholes that we will never hear. A shivering sentry across from Warden tried to talk the feeling back into his friend's hands. A Belgian father whispered to his daughter the names of the saints who might be listening. A field artillery captain murmured into his radio. The digits that meant fire, left 100, had 2. Fire for effect, lift. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion rolled their Hellcats into new positions, knowing that the snow hid both danger and chance. Those open-topped machines, their crews wrapped in blankets that billowed as they sped from hedge to hedge, were often the loudest answer when German armor tried to muscle its way into the ring. They would bite, skid, bite again, then race away to where the next bite would count. The men inside them stank of oil and cordite and fear contained behind jokes. Where not surrounded, one of them told a paratrooper in passing, grinning through a scarf frozen in a smile, we're in a target-rich environment. By then, the siege had a rhythm. Night was the worst and best time. If the Germans attacked in force, the sky pulsed with artillery and flares like a fever dream. If they did not, the nights were so quiet you could hear a man die a field away and not know his name. The Americans learned the German trick of infiltrating in white smocks to blend with snow. They learned to check passwords hard, and sometimes at the end of a long, tense conversation, one side would be right and one side would be dead. Rats came into cellars and silvered the edges of blankets with their whiskers. Men learned to sit on their helmets to keep cold earth from finding a route through their bones. They learned to dig under logs and hide small candles in the cracks, so a tiny point of fire would not show to a watching enemy, and warmth and light could pool in a handmade cave. Out beyond Bastogne and Neff, the 501st held like a knot. German infantry came in waves, feeling for loose ground, and the Americans threw them back yard by yard with rifle fire and grenades. Machine guns chattered until oil froze in their receivers. The regimental aid stations filled with men whose faces were the same gray as the snow beneath them. Something like religion found its way into a lot of mouths. On the west, near Champ and Hamrul, the 502nd and the 327th dug themselves into a position that would matter most in a few days. In the south, at Marvy, the 327th refit was cancelled by necessity and replaced with a calculus of necessity and courage. One platoon to hold the roadblock, one tank, one bazooka, and a man who believed he could use it well enough to matter. Supply was a gnawing tooth. In the second week of the siege, by the enforced calendar of encirclement, the 101st and attached units were living on thin rations and thinner ammunition. Bandages were unrolled, washed, and rolled again. More fine serrettes were broken open with fingers that didn't want to open, counted and counted again. There is a particular ache in a surgeon's throat when he knows that what will kill a man could be undone by a thing that is sitting by the runway at an airfield, only 100 miles away, if only the sky would lift. And then it did. On December 23rd, the clouds broke like a curtain pulled aside. The edge of blue looked like another country. In the clear cold, the long wings appeared Douglas C-47s, their engines like a hymn. They came in line abreast, then in a slow stampede, and parachutes walked down the air in drifts of color. Men ran into the fields with their eyes on the sky, tripping and laughing and swearing, and hauled in crates of what they needed most. Red for ammunition, green for rations, white for medical supplies. A drop marker on a field, flags staked in, and then the delirious logic of sacking. Bring in the shells before the Germans do. Find the bandages before the civilians do, because everyone needs them. Prise open wooden boxes with bayonets stabbed where they belong and not into your hand, because excitement moves hands to places where caution should stand. Along with the parachutes came gliders on the 26th, skidding in like swans, whose legs were too short for the ice. Inside were surgeons, plasma, and blood, the kind of cargo that turns a philosophy of care into a practice. In the church-turned hospital, hope took shape on tables scrubbed with boiled water. Dr. Jack Pryor and his staff could finally draw a line in a ledger where the ink had been running out. That moment of gift did not erase the siege. It burnished it. The loaves were still counted one by one and broken in careful hands. The shells still went out measured by need rather than desire. But the sky had sent a reminder that a part of the world which had seemed abandoned had not, in fact, forgotten. The men looked up and felt, in the warmth of their transient sun, the presence of an air force that had been grounded by weather and a home that wanted them to live. On Christmas Eve, the Luftwaffe came for the town in return, streaking in under the edge of the Allied canopy to drop bombs that found the heart of a place already weak with hurt. One of them fell on the convent hospital. Fire and smoke took the rooms where Renée, Lemaire, and Augusta Chiwy had stood their own siege for days without sleep. Renée, by then the angel of Bastogne, to the men whose pain she had held, died in the blaze as she tried to pull the wounded out of the killing light. Augusta, thrown to the floor by the blast and seared by the heat, staggered out and back and out again, her face streaked with soot, her voice carrying the names of strangers so that someone would live to answer to them. In some stories of war, We reserve the word hero for those who pull a trigger. To tell the story of Bastogne without saying it in a different way would be a failure of witness. By Christmas Day, the men in foxholes were thinking about home with a longing so powerful that it took on the weight of a thing carried. Some carved small trees out of sticks and hung grenade pins from them. Some passed around a bottle, while the man who owned it swore he didn't know how it had come into his pack. Nuns pressed hot broth into hands that had not felt anything warm in days. A Catholic mass murmured in Latin was answered by boys from Tennessee and New Jersey with the same amen. Their heads bowed beneath helmets that had held more snow than they had dignity left to knock off. And outside, the tankers and the infantry stood at the edges of the town, waiting for a sound that would mean something had to be done at once, and they would do it, and then wait again. At dawn on Christmas Day, the worst of the day stood up all at once at the perimeter west and northwest of Bastogne. The Germans had not made this a feast day. They had massed their armor and infantry in the darkness, and now drove at the ring near Champs and Hamrul with the kind of force that would settle all questions if the ring broke. In the faint light, the snow reflected just enough of the sky to make the movement visible and not yet shareable. It felt like being underwater when the sharks come. Across the fields, you could see them. Low shapes with turrets and the lazy power of tracked machines. Infantry clustered behind and beside them like small shadows. Panzer-Lehr elements had worked their way into position, and other units that had not expected to be in this exact place on this exact day found themselves in front of paratroopers who had taught themselves that morning to shoot at the places on a tank where pain unfolds into immobility. The 502nd Parachute Infantry's line dips and bulges came alive. A man with a bazooka lay still under a hedge, felt a friend's hand find his ankle. A squeeze, not a pull, and waited until the white cross on a tank's glacis plate was so large that it became his whole world, then fired. The belly of a panzer is an inch thick in some places and a prayer in others. That day, prayers were answered in the language of steel. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion raced into the space behind the infantry like partisans at a country dance. They used their speed the way other men use luck. A Hellcat would come up, brake hard, throw snow off its hull at a rooster tail, fire once, twice, and then the driver would slam gears, and the machine would leap backward into the lee of a house as a German shell found the empty space where it had been. The men in the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery laid their guns into direct fire, their barrels leveled at tanks whose crews had always thought that artillery belonged miles away in a kind of safety. Direct fire artillery in a snow field does not change the weather, but it warms the air in waves. Toward Hamrul, a club of anti-aircraft gunners with their 90mm and 40mm pieces depressed and sighted for groundwork joined the chorus. Tracers stitched red into white, wrote grammar into chaos. Tanks caught fire and burned blue and orange and black. Men ran from them with their clothes burning until snow claimed both man and flame. The 327th Glider Infantry, throughout the Southern Arcs, held roadblocks against armor with a hardness learned in England and refined in the winter textbooks of the Ardennes. There is an odd intimacy to battle in snow. Sound travels farther, light is sharper, and body heat makes the men around you seem closer than they are. All of that conspired to make the fights that morning feel like they were happening in a small room. It also made the moments of humor feel like contraband. A paratrooper at Hamrul, watching a tank burn, muttered that a man could roast a Christmas goose on that if he had one. Another said his mother's goose had never come with the smell of diesel. The laugh that followed had edges on it, but it was a human sound in a morning built for metal. By midday, the worst of the thrust had been blunted. Panthers and Panzer IVs lay with their tracks off and their turrets crooked. The snow around them the color of old grapes from oil and cooling steel. The Germans pulled back beyond the low ridges to put themselves on the far side of effective small arms fire, while their mortar wrote ciphers in the air. The ring held. The ring made the day longer for everyone inside it. The rest of Christmas Day seemed to pause, then spool forward. Men ate what they had, and tried not to think about what the people they loved were doing, that the distance between those kitchens and these foxholes was longer than miles, longer than nights. In the afternoon, one unit opened a crate from the airdrop that held nothing but mail. The letters went to the men whose names were on the envelopes, and then each one went into a pocket close to a heart. Beyond the ring, Patton's Third Army was coming. That statement is both precise and, for many, the only thing that mattered. In the weeks before, General George S. Patton had been asked if he could pivot his forces north into Belgium and relieve a town cut off from all but its will. He had said he could, and then he had done what men like him make a habit of doing in every chapter of war. He turned a promise into movement. The 4th Armored Division, under Major General Hugh Gaffey, bit into roads clogged with the leavings of winter war and pushed. Combat Command B, spearheaded by the 37th Tank Battalion, led by a lieutenant colonel whose name would become legend twice. Creighton Abrams drove up through smaller towns and larger fire. Relief is not cartoon. It is a series of delaying actions, supply snares, blown bridges, rerouted columns, weather that conspires, and enemy units that are not about to let you accomplish something as simple as reaching a friend. From Arlen to Habay, from Martlange to Remoyville, from Warnock to Chaumont, the 4th Armored fought its own relentless geography of minefields and ambushes and linked artillery arcs. At each choke point, men came off tanks to scout ahead. Men went down and did not get up. And the machine that is a division measured itself by inches, stolen from a stronger foresight and an aggressiveness that felt like madness unless it worked. On December 26th, the sky still pale with winter, the 37th Tank Battalion reached the last patch of fields before the perimeter near Senois. The story of that approach has its own small pieties. A white sheet held up on a stick with a cross painted on it to signal the Americans beyond. A flare fired and another flare in reply. An engineer roadblock crew, gaunt and snow-splotched, waiting with the brash equanimity of tired men to see if the thing everyone had believed could be done would actually happen today. The field gave way to a lane. The lane gave way to a road lined with beat-up trees, and the road went into the ring. A 37th Tank Battalion Sherman, one of the Thunderbolt series. Abrams's habit of naming his mounts rolled up to a knot of paratroopers who looked like men made of smoke and frost. A man on the tank waved and grinned. A man in the ditch waved back and wept. They shook hands bare. The crack in the ring was not a freeway. It was a thread pulled through heavy cloth that could be cut again with malice and effort. But it was open, and there was a convoy being formed within hours with the worst and most precious of all cargoes, the walking wounded and the stretcher-borne, moving south, and a convoy heading north with gasoline, ammunition, and the promise of a road that did not end in white wilderness full of enemy. The siege had broken in a technical sense. In a human sense, it did not end right away. The Germans continued to push around the edges of the salient, leading to fights that would snake into January as the Bulge itself was hammered flat. The men in Bastogne did not pack their gear and march off the day after Abrams shook a paratrooper's hand. They went back to their foxholes and their killing fields and did what they had done every day: hold. They had made a place on the map where the war itself had to split and go around. And like an ember in a hearth, you think is out until you feel heat. When you put your palm near it, the name of the town began to glow. The cost had been already paid in pieces. In the north at Navo, Martin Desabray's stubbornness had bought time and blood. At Bastogne and Neuf, where the 501st made itself into a wall. In the west at Champs and Hemrol, where fields were glazed with fire. In the south at Marvy, where one more German push had been blunted with a handful of rifles and the logic of no. In the heart of the town, where a woman's life had been added to a trench of memory, and another woman kept working after her hair had been singed and her hands were raw. Across the ring, African-American artillerymen of the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, joined by survivors from the 333rd, had fired big guns that turned the names of roads into coordinates and the shapes of houses into line breaks. They did it in a time when their own country did not invite them easily to the front rank of its moral self-regard. Bastogne leveled some ledgers even as it made others heavy. By the last days of December, Germans fell back a few fields at a time. The 101st sent patrols out into woods where the silence felt like an ambush and often was. The resupply convoys went both ways. A chaplain wrote the names of the dead into a book that would be difficult to read later, his pencil trailing where his tears had gathered on the page. McAuliffe walked the snow-beaten streets and thanked men by their first names and their ranks interchangeably. And when he slept at all, it was the sleep of a man who has placed something heavy down for a second to pick up something heavier. The siege ended, but the winter did not. January 1945 rolled in on iron wheels. The Bulge, the huge blunt fist of Hitler's last offensive, began to sag and then to flatten under the pressure of counterattacks from north and south. Bastogne, once behind German lines that lapped like waves against stone, was again a place where Allied traffic moved through the day, and soldiers browsed for postcards at a shop where the window had been mended with cardboard. The 101st Airborne still held the local line. They attacked as they always had, with the precision of men who understood that initiative was a language spoken best with a rifle, and they took ground in frozen fields whose names are pronounced now by docents in museums and by veterans on their last visits with a carelessness born of modesty. McAuliffe, answering congratulations, demurred the way men do who have made a habit of not believing their own press. He spoke of his men, of attached tanks, of gunners who could build a mathematics of safety from the numbers on a fuse, of engineers who could turn a road from a hazard into an artery in an afternoon, of civilians who kept life alive with bread and blessings. He spoke of the way the sky had opened as a measure not just of deliverance, but of continuity, of a world that, for all its broken promises, had decided not to leave a small town to become a grave. There was a controversy later that belongs in the gentle drawer of military ribbing. When Patton's men made the link at Assenois, they did what relief forces do. They said they had relieved the place. When the 101st men were told they had been relieved, a kind of pride that is both sharp and earned flickered. Relieved? Went the joke. We're still here. The truth is in the joke. Relief is not an exit. It is an entrance into a new phase of the same fight. The men in Bastogne did not measure their honor by whether the story said they were relieved. They measured it in the work they had done when there was no reasonable expectation of endurance. The ledger on the other side of the hill is easier to misunderstand, and it deserves a line or two. The German soldiers who died around Bastogne were not all ideologues at the end of their rope. Many were boys whose uniforms hung on them like the clothes of older brothers, veterans of the Eastern Front, with faces that did not know how to smile. Any more conscripts who had been told by the last paper they had read that this was a chance to return the map to 1940. Their commanders von Manteuffel above, von Luttwitz at the level that mattered to Bastogne. No, professionals fighting an unwinnable war with an operational art that can be admired at the same time the cause it served is condemned. Soldiers on both sides froze. Soldiers on both sides wrote letters home that spoke about mud and bread and love. The difference between the regimes did not make the cold warmer in the foxhole. It did make the fight matter in a way that outlived its ice. The story that comes down to us sometimes ends with the handshake between a tanker with Thunderbolt painted on his steel and a paratrooper with frost in his eyebrows. That is a good place to pause, but not to stop. There is more. In the hospital that had been hit on Christmas Eve, the stone walls were blackened. Augusta Chiwy continued to tend to the wounded until the last of them was evacuated. For decades her name was known mostly in the quiet way that people pass gratitude on in folded corners of conversations, until it took its rightful place in public memory. Renée Lemaire's grave became a place where men who had gone home and raised families and lived long, ordinary lives with a light in them stopped and bowed their heads. The African-American gunners of the 969th went home to a country still trapped in a small mind on a big subject. Their valor and endurance helped shame that mind into growing. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion and the 10th Armored Division, battered teams returned to a fight that would carry them across a Germany that had gone from the color of banners to the color of ashes. Bastogne is a place in peacetime where children ride bicycles around a star-shaped memorial on a hill east of town that lists the states of a nation across the Atlantic Ocean. The Mardassan Memorial feels like a stone crown set on the head of a memory that needed a structure. The Bastogne War Museum and the Nuts sign, the plaques and the street names, the carefully preserved murals of Saints Peter and Paul in the church, rebuilt and cleaned of smoke. All of these are guideposts in a story that, at its heart, is more fragile than stone. It lives in the air, between words, when an old man tells a younger one that the snow was deeper than a boy could imagine, that the sky had a sound when it opened on December 23rd, that hunger felt like a cousin of fear, but could be pushed aside by the taste of coffee in a helmet. It lives in letters and in the absence of letters, in names carved on granite, and in names that survived only in someone's memory too long to last forever. As we stand at the edge of Bastogne in our minds and let the wind lift the hair at our temples, we can see something that is less about war than about the human capacity to define ourselves in the worst of times. The 101st Airborne Division was given a job that, in the arc of strategy, was about roads and rivers and a port conquered months before. They made it their own by making it about the men next to them and the civilians under their protection, about the discipline of doing one's duty when it seems like no one is coming, and the professionalism of pulling a trigger only when you must, and with care about where the bullets land among homes and histories. They're nuts. was not just a defiance to an enemy. It was a declaration to themselves that they could be more than frightened bodies in a cold place. It was, finally, an insistence that certain words, courage, decency, stubbornness, are not just carved into memorials in easier years, but lived out in the hard ones. When you go to Bastogne, or when you imagine it standing where you are now, walk the perimeter in your thoughts. Foy's orchards and the road to Novel, the eastern slopes near Neff and Bizery, the south at Marvy, and the lanes to Villers-le-Bonneau, the west were Champs. Faces fields that look like any other until you know what they cost. Think about the cold that makes the air sting and the warmth of a hand extended from a tank to a man who has been in a ditch too long. Think about a one-word letter that sent a message around the world and into the future. Think about the sound a parachute makes when it cracks open above a starving army. Think about the way two nurses chose their place and stood in it, and then carry some of that with you, not as a weight that stoops your shoulders, but as a kind of useful gravity. The world is still full of winters that come fast and insist on lengths we had not planned for. It is still full of crossroads, towns, literal and figurative, that need defending, even when the calendars say we have earned a rest. The example here is not that we must be soldiers or paratroopers or tankers. It is that we must, in our own perimeters, find ways to say no to fear and yes to one another, to roll our own long odds into short deeds, to send help through a break in the clouds when someone cries out, to recognize that the people who hold the bandages matter as much as the people who hold the line. In the end, the last stand of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne is not a relic but a living thing. It asks us to remember, because memory is a kind of action. It asks us to speak plainly when correctness would be safer, but less true. It asks us to be when the weather of our time turns bad and the horizon goes gray, the kind of people who, cold and hungry, surrounded and tired, still look up at a messenger bearing the worst set of options and find in ourselves the ability to choose a word that means we will fight for the shape of a better day.